People say power is measured by wealth or influence, but what if it was hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The line at the bank moved slowly, the low hum of chatter filling the air as customers checked their watches, sighed, or distracted themselves with their phones. Kaitlyn Thompson stood near the front, her purse tucked under one arm, fingers drumming lightly against her side. She had been here countless times before, same bank, same routine, nothing special. Today was supposed to be no different. The bank's air conditioning blasted a little too aggressively, sending an occasional chill down her spine. The scent of paper, ink, and faint traces of cheap cologne from the man ahead of her lingered in the air. Finally, the customer before her stepped away and she stepped forward, offering a polite nod to the teller. The woman behind the counter, Deborah Simmons, barely acknowledged her. Her gaze flickered up for half a second before returning to the computer screen. Kaitlyn placed her ID and check on the counter, her voice calm and clear. "I'd like to make a deposit." Deborah picked up the ID, studied it for a moment, and then set it down without a word. Her fingers tapped against the keyboard, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Account number?" Kaitlyn recited it from memory. She had expected a simple transaction, maybe a forced smile from the teller, the usual monotony of the bank. What she didn't expect was the sudden hesitation from Deborah, the way her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced between the ID and Kaitlyn's face. "I'm going to need another form of identification." Kaitlyn blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Excuse me?" Deborah folded her arms, leaning slightly forward. "Do you have another ID, a passport maybe, something else to verify this account belongs to you?" A beat of silence passed. Kaitlyn's fingers curled against the counter's edge. She had used this bank for years, deposited checks, withdrew money, never once had an issue. "My driver's license has always been enough," she said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Deborah shrugged. "It's just policy." "Since when?" Another shrug. "We've had some concerns lately. Need to be extra careful." Kaitlyn knew what this was. She had seen it before, felt it before. That unspoken doubt, the subtle but deliberate way some people treated her differently. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge beneath it. "And what concerns are those?" Deborah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the check and examined it, as if something about it was suspicious. "How did you get this check?" she asked. Kaitlyn's stomach tightened. "It was issued to me." Deborah exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I just need another ID. If you don't have one, I can't process this transaction." Kaitlyn's pulse drummed in her ears. The room felt smaller. She glanced behind her, noticing the other customers shifting uncomfortably, pretending not to listen. The security guard, Terrence Miller, leaned slightly against the wall, his expression neutral but watchful. She reached into her bag and pulled out a second form of identification. A work ID, nothing official, but enough to prove who she was. Deborah barely glanced at it. "Do you have something government-issued?" Kaitlyn clenched her jaw. "I just gave you my driver's license." "I need more than that." Kaitlyn inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Let me speak to your manager." Deborah's lips tightened. She hesitated, then, with obvious reluctance, turned to press a button beneath the counter. A moment later, Charles Whitmore, the branch manager, appeared from his office. He was an older man, polished and composed, his expression unreadable as he approached. "Is there an issue?" Deborah didn't hesitate. "She doesn't have sufficient identification for the transaction." Kaitlyn met his gaze. "I gave her my license, and I've banked here for years." Charles sighed, rubbing his chin. "Miss Thompson," she finished. He nodded. "Let me take a look." Deborah handed him the ID and check, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges before letting go. Charles examined them, flipping the check over, glancing at Kaitlyn, then at the screen in front of him. His expression didn't change, but something about the way he straightened his tie, the quick glance he threw toward Deborah, made Kaitlyn's stomach twist. "Ms. Thompson," he said slowly, "would you mind signing the back of the check for me?" Kaitlyn frowned but took the pen he offered. She had done this 100 times before, no hesitation, no second thought. The pen's tip glided across the paper, her signature forming with the same precision it always had. The moment she lifted the pen, the energy in the room shifted. Charles stiffened. Deborah froze. The security guard, who had been idly watching from the side, straightened his posture. Monica Reed, another teller who had been silently processing transactions at the adjacent counter, suddenly turned her head. Her eyes widened slightly as they flickered between the signature and Kaitlyn's face. A silence so heavy it felt tangible filled the space. Kaitlyn looked up. "What?" Charles swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took another glance at the check, then back at the screen. This signature," he said, his voice oddly careful, "matches." He trailed off, and for the first time since she had stepped foot in the bank, Kaitlyn saw something she hadn't expected. Not skepticism, not dismissal, something closer to disbelief. "What's going on?" she asked. Deborah's face had lost a shade of its color. Her hand hovered near her keyboard, like she wasn't sure whether to continue typing or shut off the screen completely. Charles inhaled deeply, then exhaled. His voice was lower this time, almost hesitant. "This signature," he murmured, "matches the one on the bank's original charter." Kaitlyn frowned. "I'm sorry, what?" Another silence. Monica, still staring, let out a quiet exhale. That's the signature of the bank's founder." Kaitlyn stared at them, the words settling around her like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. For the first time, Deborah didn't look smug. She looked confused. Terrence, the security guard, took a step forward, his gaze shifting between them all. Charles set the check down carefully, as if it had suddenly become something fragile. His voice, though calm, held a weight to it. "Miss Thompson, I think we need to have a conversation." Kaitlyn stared at the bank manager, Charles Whitmore, waiting for him to explain. The words he had just spoken made no sense. Her signature matched the one on the bank's original charter? What did that even mean? The other employees exchanged uncertain glances, their professional masks slipping into something closer to shock. Deborah, who had been so firm about denying Kaitlyn's transaction, now stood motionless, gripping the edge of the counter, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Kaitlyn crossed her arms. "You're going to have to run that by me again, because I'm not following." Charles hesitated, then motioned toward his office. "Miss Thompson, if you'd come with me for a moment. We need to talk privately." A prickle of unease ran down Kaitlyn's spine. She had come here for a simple deposit, not some cryptic meeting in a back office. And yet, there was something in his expression, not fear exactly, but deep uncertainty, that made her want answers. She glanced at the security guard, Terrence Miller, who had taken a step forward, his broad frame tensed like he was preparing for something bigger than a routine bank dispute. "I think I'd rather stay right here," Kaitlyn said, her voice steady. "You can explain whatever's going on in front of everyone, since they're already listening." A flicker of something, respect maybe, passed over Charles's face before he sighed and nodded. "Fair enough," he said, placing the check on the counter. "Ms. Thompson, this signature of yours, it matches an old document we have in our records. A very old document." Kaitlyn raised an eyebrow. "Okay. And, Charles continued, that document happens to be the founding charter of this bank, signed over a century ago by someone with the same last name as you." Silence stretched between them, the words settled in the air, thick and heavy. Kaitlyn scoffed. "What, so I just happen to have the same last name as some old banker? That's not exactly shocking news." Charles shook his head. "It's not just the last name, it's the handwriting. The signature on the charter is identical to yours, right down to the way the T crosses." Deborah let out a disbelieving huff. "That's ridiculous. That's impossible." Monica, the other teller, was staring at the signature again, But it really does look the same, she muttered. Kaitlyn's stomach twisted. She had never given much thought to her family history. Her mother had raised her on her own, and the little she knew about her father's side of the family was vague at best. But this is crazy, she said. Maybe it just looks similar. Charles turned toward his office. Wait here. Kaitlyn exchanged a glance with Terence, who was still watching everything unfold with careful eyes. A minute later, Charles returned with a thick, leather-bound book, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum. He set it down carefully, flipping through its pages with an almost reverent touch. Then he stopped. He turned the book toward Kaitlyn. There, on a yellowed piece of parchment, was an old, faded signature. The exact same one Kaitlyn had just written. The breath left her lungs in a slow, measured exhale. She felt the weight of eyes on her, Deborah's disbelief, Monica's fascination, Charles's quiet scrutiny. I don't understand, Kaitlyn murmured. Charles studied her carefully. Miss Thompson, do you have any knowledge of your ancestry? Kaitlyn hesitated. Not much, she admitted. My mother never talked about it, and I never knew my father. Charles nodded as if that confirmed something he was already considering. This bank was founded in 1896 by a man named Benjamin Thompson, he said. A man who, according to every record we have, disappeared without a trace shortly after signing this document. Kaitlyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What do you mean, disappeared? Charles leaned forward. I mean exactly that. One day he was here, running this bank, making a name for himself. The next he was gone. No body, no farewell letters, no records of where he went. Deborah scoffed. What, you think she's, what, a reincarnation? Kaitlyn glared at her. I think I'd rather hear from someone who isn't trying to get rid of me 5 minutes ago. Deborah shut her mouth, her lips pressed thin. Charles, ignoring the exchange, tapped the page. This bank has been in operation for over a century, passed through different hands, different names, but that original signature, that's never changed. The charter still bears it, and now, somehow, so does your check. Kaitlyn felt her pulse in her ears. This was surreal. I don't know what to tell you, she admitted. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with this information. Charles exhaled. Neither do I. Terence, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Seems like something that shouldn't just be ignored. Deborah rolled her eyes. It's just a coincidence. Is it? Monica asked softly. The weight of it all pressed down on Kaitlyn. She had walked into this bank expecting the usual nonsense, the usual small hurdles thrown her way. Instead, she had stumbled into something bigger than herself, a legacy she didn't even know she was a part of. She looked at the check, then at the signature in the book, then back at Charles. So, she said, what happens now? Charles didn't answer immediately. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk, his thoughts clearly running a mile a minute. We verify, he finally said. We go through the records, we check every possible explanation, and if nothing else makes sense. He trailed off, but Kaitlyn finished the sentence in her head. If nothing else made sense, then the impossible might actually be real. The silence in the bank stretched long enough for Kaitlyn to hear her own heartbeat. She stared at the old parchment, at the signature that was undeniably identical to hers, and felt something she couldn't quite name settle in her chest. This wasn't just a banking issue anymore. This was something else entirely. Charles Whitmore looked at her like she was a puzzle missing its last piece, the key to something that had been lost for over a century. Deborah's skepticism still clung to the air, thick and dismissive, but even she wasn't pushing as hard now. Monica, on the other hand, couldn't take her eyes off the signature. The tension in the room shifted, and Kaitlyn could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She needed to get out of here. I don't know what you expect me to do with this, she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. Charles didn't immediately answer. He just closed the old book with careful precision and folded his hands over it. "I expect you to be curious." Curious. That was one way to put it. She reached for the check and slipped it back into her purse. "If I cash this at another bank, will they also make me question my entire existence, or is this just a you thing?" Monica let out a quiet chuckle, but Charles didn't smile. "This is more than just a signature, Miss Thompson." "Maybe," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean I want to deal with it right now." Charles hesitated, then nodded. "I understand." Did he? Because Kaitlyn barely understood herself. She turned to leave, but Terrence, the security guard, spoke up. "Wait." She paused, looking at him. "You don't want to at least find out who he was, Benjamin Thompson?" Kaitlyn exhaled slowly. The rational part of her brain screamed to walk out, to let this be someone else's mystery. But another part, the part that had always felt slightly untethered, slightly out of place in the world, hesitated. She looked at Charles. "What do you actually know about him?" Charles tapped his fingers against the leather-bound book, considering. "Not as much as I'd like," he admitted. "Records from that time aren't exactly pristine. What we do know is that he was a businessman, an innovator in finance, and for reasons no one ever figured out, he disappeared. Just vanished. No crime scene, no debt, no reason to run. He was successful, respected. Then one day, he was gone." Kaitlyn frowned. "And no one thought to investigate?" "They did," Charles said. "But the world was different back then. Paper trails got lost, the bank kept running under new management, and eventually the mystery of Benjamin Thompson faded into history." She glanced at the book again, her fingers itching slightly. This wasn't her problem. It shouldn't be her problem. But then again, "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Charles studied her for a moment, then carefully pushed the book toward her. "Take a look through it. Maybe something will stand out to you." Deborah made a noise of protest. "Are we seriously entertaining this?" Charles shot her a sharp glance. "If you have somewhere more important to be, Deborah, by all means." Deborah huffed but didn't argue further. Kaitlyn hesitated, then slowly opened the book. The pages were thick with age, the ink faded but still legible. There were official documents, names she didn't recognize, historical records of transactions that didn't mean much to her. And then, on a page toward the middle, something caught her eye. A personal note. Unlike the rest of the documents, this one wasn't a business contract or financial record. It was written in a neat, careful hand, addressed to no one in particular. She read aloud. "I have done what I must, but I fear what comes next. The weight of this institution is heavy, heavier than I imagined. If I do not return, let it be known that I acted in good faith and that my name shall not be forgotten." Kaitlyn's breath hitched. Her name. Not hers, but still hers. It wasn't just the signature that matched. It was something deeper than that. She looked up at Charles, then at Terrence, then at Monica. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Charles exhaled, leaning back. "I think that's what we're trying to figure out." Kaitlyn stared at the words again, her fingers pressing lightly against the old paper. She should walk away from this. But something told her she wouldn't. Kaitlyn stared at the words on the page, her mind racing. The name wasn't just a coincidence. The signature wasn't just a quirk of handwriting. There was something more to this, something deeper, something that had been waiting over a century to be uncovered. The bank had continued without Benjamin Thompson, his story forgotten, his name erased from its history. And yet, here she was, standing in the very institution he had founded, holding proof that his name, her name, had never truly disappeared. She exhaled, placing a hand on the document as if grounding herself to reality. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. "How could my signature be the same as his? That's not possible." Charles Whitmore studied her carefully, his fingers steepled together. "I don't have an answer for you, Miss Thompson. But I do know this. Benjamin Thompson was more than just a banker. He was a visionary, someone who built something meant to last. And for whatever reason, fate has led you back here." Kaitlyn bit her lip, her thoughts tangling into knots. She wasn't sure she believed in fate, but this was impossible to ignore. She glanced at Monica, who was still staring at the document with wide eyes. Even Deborah, skeptical and stiff, looked unsettled, her arms crossed but her gaze flicking between the book and Kaitlyn. The only person who seemed completely calm was Terrence, the security guard, who simply nodded, as if he had seen enough in life to know that some things just couldn't be explained. "Okay," Kaitlyn finally said, straightening. "Let's say for a second that this isn't just some ridiculous coincidence. What do I do with this information?" Charles exhaled, running a hand through his silver hair. "That depends. Do you want to walk away from this, or do you want to find out why your name is written in this bank's foundation?" Kaitlyn hesitated. She could leave. That was the easiest option. Take her check, go to another bank, pretend none of this had ever happened. But something inside her refused to let her walk away. Her whole life, she'd felt like she was missing something. Like there was a part of her history, her roots, that had been left behind. She had grown up without any real connection to her father's side of the family, never knowing where she came from beyond what little her mother had told her. And now, here it was, the missing piece. "I want to know," she said, her voice steady. "I need to know." Charles nodded. "Then let's start with the records." He turned back to his office, motioning for Kaitlyn to follow. She glanced at the others, Monica looking eager, Deborah watching with barely concealed curiosity, and Terrence giving her a small, knowing nod. Then she stepped forward. Charles's office was lined with dark wooden shelves, filled with folders and old ledgers that smelled faintly of dust and time. He pulled open a drawer and withdrew a file marked Thompson, Benjamin. "This is everything we have on him," Charles said, placing the folder on the desk. "It's not much, but maybe you'll find something." Kaitlyn reached for it, her fingers brushing against the worn edges. She opened it slowly, scanning the pages. Birth records, business contracts, letters, and then at the very back, something unexpected. A deed. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. It was a legal document, signed by Benjamin Thompson himself, transferring ownership of his stake in the bank to his descendants, to his bloodline, to her. She blinked. "Wait. What is this?" Charles leaned forward. "That," he said, "is proof that Benjamin Thompson never intended to abandon his legacy. He wanted it to remain in his family. But when he disappeared, there was no one left to claim it." Kaitlyn's breath hitched. "So, you're telling me that technically, legally, you are the rightful owner of a significant portion of this bank," Charles finished, his voice calm but filled with meaning. Silence stretched across the room. Kaitlyn could hear her own pulse thudding in her ears. This wasn't just a signature match. This wasn't just a lost piece of history. This was hers. She swallowed hard. "This can't be real." "It is," Charles said simply, "and it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it." She sat back, trying to process everything. A few hours ago, she had walked in just trying to deposit a check. Now she was staring at a piece of paper that told her she had more claim to this institution than anyone working here. She thought about the way Deborah had treated her, the way people doubted her, asked for more proof, questioned her legitimacy. And now she had proof that she belonged here more than any of them ever had. A slow, determined smile crept onto her lips. "I think," she said, "it's time for this bank to remember its real history." Charles grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Legal consultations, historical confirmations, meetings with board members who could barely hide their shock when they learned the truth. Kaitlyn stood her ground, making it clear that she wasn't just some forgotten name in an old ledger. She was here, she was present, and she was reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Deborah, despite her initial attitude, eventually came around, begrudgingly at first, but then with genuine respect. Monica, always the quiet observer, became one of Kaitlyn's strongest allies in sorting through the bank's tangled past. And Charles? He became a mentor, helping her navigate the corporate world she had never expected to be part of. It took time, patience, and more than a few battles, but in the end, the name Thompson was restored to the bank's official records, not just as a historical footnote, but as a name that mattered, a name that had never truly been lost. And as Kaitlyn stood in front of the building one morning, her name now engraved alongside the others who had shaped its legacy, she felt something settle deep inside her. A sense of belonging, a sense of home. This was her history, and she was finally ready to embrace it.